Welcome back to another episode of Podcast on the Brink. The regular season concludes Sunday afternoon / evening, 4:30, kind of a different start time, but CBS will have the game. Michigan comes to Assembly Hall, and no better guest to help us preview this game than Dylan Burkhardt of UMHoops. Welcome back to the show, Dylan.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.
So last night, I intently watched the game in Champaign. I thought it was a great opportunity for Michigan, obviously, to get a win there. What, I guess from your perspective, went wrong down the stretch for the Wolverines? It seemed like they really kind of had a grip on the game there, and then Illinois, I think late in regulation, kind of changed momentum, and then obviously the loss in double overtime really hurts Michigan NCAA tournament chances, I would think.
Yeah, so it's kind of just how the season has gone for Michigan. Obviously, people listening to this podcast will remember the Indiana game in Ann Arbor where Michigan didn't score for the last 5 minutes, lost by 1. Michigan followed that up at Wisconsin, held Wisconsin without a field goal for the last 10 minutes, lost the game. Michigan lost on a 4-point play at Iowa in overtime. So it's kind of been a story of close losses. And the flip side is most of Michigan's wins haven't been close, other than that Wisconsin buzzer beater in overtime. So a lot of frustration there from a Michigan point of view of just, I think this is a team playing well enough to not just like play in the NCAA tournament, but to make, like, I think you would like them to maybe win a game in the NCAA tournament. But the reality is they still haven't done enough to make the field. And that is kind of where things sit. That Illinois game, it was really a interesting battle of two teams that don't really match up all that well. Illinois made the smart move in the second half to stop playing Dane Danger and to go with Coleman Hawkins at the 5, play 5 out, gave Michigan fits. I think they took a 9-point lead, basically just spreading Michigan out, pulling Hunter Dickinson away from the basket and driving to the rim, getting fouled. Michigan kind of countered with that, went two bigs, put Hunter Dickinson on Ty Rodgers, who's kind of just out of the action. And that really helped. Michigan should have lost that game in regulation. I think they're down 7 with about 2:30 to play, fought their way all the way back, tied the game, had a chance to win, and then missed that shot, got up 7 in overtime, let that lead slip away, missed the shot to win, then got down in overtime, second overtime that is, and missed, airballed a wide open 3 to tie the game with 10 seconds left. It was a wild game, really fun game. Two teams that I don't think either really figured out the right answer, right? Like Hunter Dickinson had a monster performance, Terrence Shannon had a monster performance, but they just went back and forth, and eventually Illinois prevailed at home.
Yeah, I think I mixed up the 7-point leads there, but I knew there were a couple of them. So
both teams drop a 7-point lead. It was a wild game. I mean, if you were at neutral, it's must see TV. If you were rooting for either of those teams, you're probably pulling your hair out.
No, it was a great back and forth game. I'm curious, just from your perspective, you watch this team as closely as anybody. Can you pinpoint one or two things that, like the game last night where Michigan struggles to close out a close game? They struggle to close out the game against Indiana, not scoring for 5-12 in the final stretch of the game. They've had a ton of close losses in Big Ten play, and that's why their efficiency margin, you look at it in Big Ten play, they're the second best team in the league, because when they win, they usually win by a lot, and then they have these close games where they can't finish out. What do you kind of see as maybe the one or two things that's a recurring theme in these close games that they're unable to do to close games?
So I think it's different now than maybe it was early in the year. So Michigan lost they kind of gacked up a game against Virginia at home early, and that was very much of a kind of a young, inexperienced team making mistakes down the stretch and just losing. You could probably put the game at Iowa in that bucket, the game against Central Michigan in that bucket. Those were a team that just hadn't really figured it out. I think anyone at this point who follows a Big Ten team that isn't Iowa knows just crazy shit happens. And sorry, I don't know if I'm supposed to swear on here, but crazy stuff happens in Iowa City, and sometimes Peyton Sanford gets a 4-point play. But I think lately it's just been a bit of just 50-50 games go in different directions. Like, I think Michigan in that first Indiana game executed pretty well down the stretch. They got good looks. Shots just didn't go in. Sometimes that happens. Wisconsin, Hunter Dickinson hits a kind of miracle 3-pointer and you tie the game, right? Like, games are going to be 50-50. You play 50-50 games. Sometimes they'll be 3 out of 4 you lose, and that's just how it goes. The game last night, I think it was really just, I think it's hard to criticize how Michigan played in those moments because of the fact that they battled back from 7. They got up, like they had some really good stretches. It was just two teams that one outlasted the other, and the breaks didn't go their way. So I think they've improved a lot. I think the backcourt kind of growing up, right? Kobe Buffkin is very young and has improved a ton. Doug McDaniel was kind of thrown into the mix in December as a spot starter when Jalen Llewellyn tore his ACL. He's really improved in kind of his game control. So they're improving, but really I think the whole team is improving, and the close game stuff, just sometimes shots don't go your way, right? Like you get a Hunter Dickinson post touch in the paint and he makes it or misses it. Like it's a 60-40 shot. It kind of is what it is.
Do you have any sense for how Michigan will respond to last night? Because it really feels like if they could have won that game, all of a sudden they come into Bloomington with momentum, they win that game, and you're talking about they're probably a tournament team. They still obviously could get there. Winning at Indiana would be huge, and wins in Chicago at the Big Ten tournament, they're definitely still in the conversation. I'm just curious from your perspective, what read you have on how Michigan will respond for the loss last night in Champaign.
I mean, it's obviously a gutting loss. You're going to play on the road at Trace Jackson Davis's senior night against an Indiana team that just got wiped and has extra days of rest. Like, all that is not a good matchup. But I think this Michigan team has shown some ability to bounce back. Like, they lost at Penn State about a month ago, just got run off the court, and basically, like, everyone on my side was ready to throw in the towel on the season and say this team's cooked. They responded, went on the road with one of their best games of the year, double-digit win at Northwestern. So they've shown that. Last year, Michigan was in a very similar situation where they needed basically one more win in the last week of the regular season. They played Iowa at home. Everyone thought that was the game you have to win. Just got annihilated. Very similar to that Indiana game in a sense. And then they went on the road without Hunter Dickinson and beat Ohio State. So I think a desperate team fighting to make their way into the NCAA tournament is always dangerous. I don't think they're just going to throw in the towel because they didn't beat Illinois, but it's definitely a tough spot to kind of rally and bounce back from after playing 50 minutes of back and forth basketball and having basically 2 open shots to potentially move a lot closer to the postseason.
One guy that's really impressed me all season was a major miss on our preseason top 25 list. Kobe Buffkin, to me, is playing as well as any guard backcourt player in the Big Ten. What has been the driving force behind his improvement as the season has gone along? And is this a guy that we're going to be seeing probably in the NBA as soon as next season? What's kind of the feel there in terms of what's next for Kobe Buffkin?
So Kobe's a really interesting case because he was a McDonald's All-American. He came in last year, had a lot of hype, but was very young. He was basically a year, like right now, he's freshman aged. So he's like he's the youngest player on Michigan's roster right now, which is a pretty crazy stat. But he really struggled last year defensively. He was skinny. He just never really got it. And this year has been a process. And the one thing that stood out all along is that he has this ability to get to the basket with the ball, right? Like he can play out of ball screens, get to the rim and finish. He's shooting, I think, around 70% at the rim, which is a crazy number for a guard who creates a lot of those shots himself. And then what has kind of swung back and forth is his three-point shot. He started the year 2 of 19 from 3. Then he got hot in December, cooled off in January. Now he's shooting, I think, like 45 plus from 3 over the last month. He's still not completely confident with that shot, but him making those threes, like he has multiple threes in the last 6 games. That kind of changes everything for Michigan offensively. And he's gone from a guy who's like, oh, this is a really nice two-way player to like, this guy looks like a pro. And you're telling me he's only as old as a freshman. So I think he's definitely on the NBA radar. Seems like the most recent buzz is like maybe a late first round pick. And like, hard to say at this point, right? Until you really know, but definitely a guy who will, I would imagine, at least go through the draft process and see what his stock is like.
So Obviously, Hunter Dickinson and Buffkin are kind of the two constants for Michigan at this point, but you've also got Jet Howard, who has kind of been in and out of the lineup with injuries. Didn't play particularly well in the Indiana game in the second half. You know, you look at Doug McDaniel, Jet Howard, and Kobe Buffkin. I think they combined for 5 points in the second half in 49 minutes, which is not what you need from your guards to win at the Big Ten level. But I'm curious with Jet Howard, you know, all this talk about Buffkin now, but he's obviously still a guy with a ton of talent. Has he, in your eyes, gotten better as the season has gone along? Because when I watch him, I still see a lot of the same basic mistakes defensively, getting lost, and he almost seems like a guy at times that Michigan has to hide defensively. So I'm curious, just kind of what you've seen out of him in terms of growth. Obviously, a great shooter, a great shot maker, a guy that can create offense, but in terms of maybe being a two-way player, just not there yet.
Yeah, so he's definitely a poor defender, poor rebounder. It's a problem for Michigan. It's not like Michigan has a two-way wing who's good at either of those things to put in his place, so that's a bit of an issue in itself. I wouldn't say he's improved in either of those areas, but the other thing is he's like the volume shooter on this roster. Michigan needs that shot making. They need someone who can hit 4 or 5 threes in a game. He's shooting 37% from three with almost 200 attempts. Like, he can hit tough step backs. He can change a game with his shooting. I think kind of he's obviously, so he missed 2 games with ankle. He missed a game earlier with the ankle. I think he's kind of been playing hurt on the ankle for stretches because his 2-point numbers had a pretty big fall off from non-conference play. But I think the biggest issue for Michigan is trying to figure out the right balance of on-ball responsibility within the offense. Like, how do you fit in Jet Howard, who can play with the ball in his hands, but probably isn't great, with Kobe Buffkin sort of turning into the star, and then Doug McDaniel, who is going to do things with the ball. He's usually going to pull up for a long two, but he's still like going to have the ball in his hands. So it's kind of like, how do you get everyone on the same page? And Michigan has kind of been trying to figure that out on the fly. I think they need Jet Howard to win this game. I think you probably go into this game and say, if Jet Howard hits 3 or 4 threes, we have a chance. And that's kind of what it boils down to for Michigan. I don't think he shot it that well in the first game. Michigan, I think, was 5 of 20 from 3. Like, this game comes down to Michigan making open threes, because I think they're going to at least get some of those. And Jet is really the guy that you look to make those shots.
Obviously, you've been, just from listening to your podcast with Brendan Quinn, you've been pretty high on Indiana for a decent part of the season, but I think a lot of Hoosier fans at this point are kind of scratching their heads when they see a week now that just transpired where Indiana goes to Purdue and wins, and then they come back home and follow that up with, you know, really a chance, if they would have just taken care of business at home, they lock up probably the 2 seed in the Big Ten tournament, and going into the conference tournament with some momentum, and they come home and Iowa scores 90 points on them. And now you look at the record against Iowa under Mike Woodson. They've lost all 4 games. He's the only program that they haven't beaten under Woodson. And I think Indiana's given up 80 points in all those games. From your perspective, do you think that performance is more of just an aberration, bad matchup type of game for Indiana, or is there longer term concerns when you look at them in terms of just not being able to capitalize on the momentum? Because to me, you know, a team like that aspires to make a run in March, at this point of the season, I would have thought they would have been able to figure out that, like, you have to come back with it and follow up the effort. And there's been examples throughout the season, like the North Carolina game, they win at home and then they come back and go to Rutgers and score 48 points and get blown out. You know, the Kansas game where they basically didn't show up. There's just so many examples of bad double-digit losses that I think a lot of people are wondering ultimately what to make of this Indiana team.
Yeah, so I'm not crazy about, like, I get it's a thing, but like the idea of, they can't follow up success or whatever. And the reality is that kind of all goes out the window in the NCAA tournament. Like, you're going to come to play an NCAA tournament game, so I don't worry about that much. I think the bigger concern is that this Indiana defense seems to just, like, sort of the bottom falls out every 5 or 10 games, whatever. Like, and when it falls out hard. And this was a team that I thought like we keep waiting to say, oh, the Indiana defense is kind of fixed, and it might just not be a very good defensive team for whatever reason. And that's my biggest concern, kind of looking forward into the postseason. Is I think when you have a team like Indiana, you can say, well, I kind of know what it's going to look like when they lose. They're going to give up 1.25 points per possession, and they're probably going to lose by double digits. Like that, I can just kind of see it because that's how every one of these losses goes. And that's my concern is, can they get something figured out defensively? Because for whatever reason, it just hasn't been able to click consistently, right? Like it's one thing to get run by Iowa, who can do that in big spots, but like Michigan State is not a great offensive team. They had a huge offensive night against Indiana. It's just, there's too many massive swings in that defensive performance to really feel confident about, I think.
How much of that, if any of it, do you think has to do with Xavier Johnson being out for as long as he has been, just based on kind of what you saw from them as a team last year defensively compared to this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's huge. I don't know if Xavier Johnson coming back at this point in the season is enough to get that back, though. That would be my concern.
Right.
I think he was a great point of attack defender. They were a better defensive team early in the year, I think, when he kind of started off. So I think it definitely makes an impact. I don't know what Xavier Johnson, after 3 months on the shelf, does for it at this point in the year, though.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's no good time to. The thing I've kind of been saying the last couple of weeks is there's no real good time with Indiana's Big Ten schedule to bring a guy back. It wasn't like they had a home game against Minnesota tucked in the schedule where you can just kind of come back and ease a guy in. At this point, they've been playing tough games now for weeks. They got Michigan coming up on Sunday, then the Big Ten tournament. There's really no, I don't think, recipe to bring a guy back. And also, if it's not going to happen tomorrow or Sunday, I kind of wonder, does he come back at all? I mean, I guess you can try it in the Big Ten tournament, but you would never want to. This is just my opinion. Correct me if you think differently, but you wouldn't want to bring a guy back for his first game back in the NCAA tournament.
I mean, what are the options, right? Like, if he can go, he can go. I know that I remember Duke did that against Michigan with Kyrie Irving way back, and he was out most of the year. Comes back, he played.
Yeah, but this is Kyrie Irving.
All right, but it's the same idea. I'm just saying it's the same idea. Why not? Like, your option is to put Tamar Bates on the court or Xavier Johnson, and your season's on the line. I think you got to try it. I don't know.
Right?
Why not?
Yeah, that's fair. What's the temp? Like, you run a community at UMHoops, kind of like the same as I do at Inside the Hall. What's like the temperature of just the Michigan fan base and their feelings about this team? It kind of feels like there's ebbs and flows like with any other program, but this season, my expectation going in was that Michigan was going to be a top 4 or 5 team in the Big Ten. They still have a chance to get there, but just the path that they've taken and kind of the fact that they're in the position that they are, I think might maybe a little bit surprising to people that they're going to have to play their way in here to finish out the regular season.
Yeah, and I think part of it ties back to being in this spot last year where there are even higher expectations. Obviously, they went and then made the Sweet 16, but it was still a season where they didn't exactly compete at the top of the Big Ten. I think there's probably some frustration of, like, there's clearly talent on this roster, and now this team is playing this well, like, and kind of having that go to waste, right? Like, Kobe Buffkin has turned into a star. Hunter Dickinson is playing pretty well over the last month or so, and you get up to that point, and if you just come up short of the NCAA tournament, it's kind of all for naught. So I think there's definitely frustration in that sense, frustration in, like, how much of the roster could turn over again, and that's kind of been the cycle that Michigan's in, where, like, you're just bringing in a whole new wave of starters based on transfers or based on the NBA, and it's a frustrating way to build a roster. And I think that is probably kind of both the core of Michigan's fans' frustrations and kind of the core of why Michigan has had these sort of up and down years, right?
Yeah, I mean that, but in some sense too, just the transfer portal, I feel like, has changed completely how you build teams in college basketball, and I think it also gives you a chance to flip things over in a positive way. after a season, and so I think that would be a key not only for Michigan and Indiana too. I mean, looking to the offseason, they're going to lose a ton. I don't know specifically what Michigan's going to lose, but say they lose Dickinson, Howard, and Buffkin. I mean, that would be pretty
It's
comparable
the whole team.
to Indiana losing Jackson Davis and Hood Schifino and Xavier Johnson. I mean, I don't know that you replace those pieces, but I just think the difference in how you build a team now is pretty stark compared to where it was 5 or 10 years ago. There was an interesting piece. I don't know if you saw it. Borzello had something on ESPN just about like the impact of freshmen in college basketball. I think we're kind of past the time where we have these super team of just freshmen that are going to reign supreme in college hoops.
Yeah, it's definitely a balance, and I also think like the margin of error and like how like the high stakes nature of the transfer portal is pretty clear. Like you just look at that Michigan Illinois game. Terrence Shannon was like 99% of the way to Ann Arbor. Michigan's a completely different team with him in that sense, right? Like Michigan's a contender in this league, I would say, and he's that good. You have an admission snafu, and all of a sudden everything goes sideways. Like that's the reality of just what you're dealing with, and if you make a good evaluation or a bad evaluation, like that's your whole season, right? So you're kind of next. Like I feel like when we started our sites like a decade ago, you would like look at kind of a class breakdown like years in advance, right? Like these guys are going to be juniors this year, and then now it's like next year's season depends on everything that happens from selection Sunday until June 1st or whatever, like whenever the NBA draft deadline is. And basically everything is up in the air. Every decision you make is going to have a huge impact on the following season.
Yeah. And I was talking to somebody close to the IU program not long ago, and they were just talking about just the timing of when the portal is going to open here. I believe it's the Monday after selection Sunday. So you're literally going to have programs preparing for their first NCAA tournament game, getting ready to tip off in their biggest games of the season, while also trying to constantly check in on the portal and see who's in there and set up visits and all that. It's just completely changed the nature of how college basketball operates. And I think another big part of it moving forward is just the NIL perspective of it's basically a wild west out there in terms of what each program can offer. And it's obviously not coming directly from the program, but these collectives have basically kind of taken over just in terms of if someone may not look at Indiana or Michigan the same as a lesser program, if the NIL stakes from that so-called lesser program are much more lucrative. So that's the thing that coaches also have to navigate. And I think one good thing for college basketball as a sport that the transfer portal has done is kind of extended the life of the season to an extent. Whereas I know we used to like kind of after the season was over, you do your postseason stuff and you kind of power down for a little bit, maybe cover a little of the live periods in the spring. Like nobody's even thinking about the live periods in April at this point. They're like, which guys are going to be in the portal? Which guys are going to be visiting? And which guys can you get like 2 or 3 guys for your team next year that are actually going to help you win? Not what play. I mean, because look at, for example, like a perfect example of this is a couple of off seasons ago, right after Mike Woodson got the job, he lands Tamar Bates, and everyone's like, well, he's a 5-star recruit. He can come in and really help. And he did some decent things last year. This year, he's obviously his development has gone in the opposite direction. And I think that's kind of a lesson in terms of what you have to look for now. You want to find a guy that's got 3 years of experience, preferably at the Power 5 level, that can come in and make an impact in terms of winning for your program. You're not looking for somebody to shake loose as a freshman and say, this guy's going to come in and make an instant impact. Maybe you get a guy, Malik Renew has been somewhat beneficial for Indiana as a late ad, but he's not one of the centerpieces of a team for Indiana this year.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty hard balance to strike because you need the sort of talent and upside of star players, and you need to build players from the ground up. Like you want upperclassmen who have been in your program, but you also have to realize like those guys aren't going to be able to compete, especially with all of these COVID seniors. Like a COVID senior is just basically like a bringing in ringers from overseas leagues, right? Like these guys are just grown-ups, and you're talking about going against freshmen who just aren't at that same level of maturity. They played 5 college basketball games instead of 200. It's just like a different entire sport in a way. So that I think has only exaggerated some of those differences. But it's definitely a different world out there, and I think there are pros and cons. Like I think it's enabled. I think there are people like to say like the portal's going to take out parity in this, and people are just going to get plucked to go to better schools. But I think there are different paths for teams to succeed up and down the chain from the portal, right? Like you could make a living off as a mid-major off of kind of scouting good recruits who have kind of not really found their way in kind of middle tier high majors, and like get those guys to transfer down. Like that's a path. Like there's all these different, there's talent out there, there's players out there. I think there's a big opening to kind of evaluate and understand what fits and where players can actually find their level.
What do you think in general a program like Indiana or Michigan set up to perform well from the portal era, like in terms of what they can? I mean, historically, these are both programs that have recruited pretty well. Looking at what they've been able to draw in, I mean, do you think an IU or a Michigan can thrive in an era where they're having to go get 2 or 3 guys every year from the portal, or do you think there's other programs that are a different type of program that would be set up better to be able to have success?
I think there's probably different routes for different schools. Michigan's big issue is more around admissions and transfer credits, and not really admissions, but transfer credits. So it's hard generally for Michigan to take like upperclassmen non-graduate transfers because of what credits transfer over. And like
so is that just like a university type? Is that kind of what happened with Shannon, to your understanding, or?
Yeah, so basically there's an NCAA rule about having a certain number of credits toward your degree. And what Michigan's problem generally is with transfers is a transfer will come from another school, will have large amounts of credits that a school at an undergraduate school at Michigan won't accept as to give credits to. So then they're too far behind. So it's not that there's an admissions issue. It's that there's a transfer. It's actually assigning credit for the new school into a matching class.
Gotcha.
That is hard to do. So that's been a big roadblock, and it's something that Michigan obviously like is trying to do better on and needs to do better on to compete in this level. NIL is obviously a huge factor. So there's a lot at play. I feel like there are going to be certain schools that can probably pluck the best transfers, the quote unquote best transfers off the market just because they have the biggest NIL offers, whatever else. I also don't know that the schools with the best NIL offers will be able to identify the best transfers, right? Like there's still a niche of, okay, there's one guy who's a star, but you can go and find 2 guys that fit exactly what you need, even if they're not on the top of Jeff Borzello or Jeff, like on the transfer ranking list, right? Like there's other options.
Where was Jalen Pickett a couple of years ago, right? I mean, he was obviously he was a name that you would look at, but he could play anywhere,
not like
right?
Every high major wanted him or anything like that. Jameer Young, right? Like there's guys out there. Like Jameer Young was probably ranked like 45th on a lot of those lists. Like, yeah, Indiana and Michigan can go and get someone like that. I don't know. I think that's for me the opening in the market. The inefficiency in the market is actually figuring out who fits what you want to do within your system.
For sure. Dylan, it's always good to talk to you. I know you've probably got to get to writing your preview of Sunday's game, Indiana, Michigan. How about that? Last preview for you to write of the regular season. How's it feel?
Last preview of the year. It has been a year, so I'm good with it being the last regular season preview of the year. Ready for Big Ten tournament in Chicago. Should be a doozy.
Thank you once again to Dylan for coming on this week's show, a podcast on the brink. We'll be back again next week at some point with some type of Big Ten tournament preview. Don't know for sure what the seeds are, other than I think Purdue's the number 1 seed, Minnesota's the 14, maybe Ohio State's the 13, something like that. At this point, everything else, I think totally up for grabs. There's a ton of games this weekend. Should be a great weekend of hoops. If you enjoy the show, as always, please leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, a rating on Spotify, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.